Hey everybody, it's me again, Randy Ray, and I'm here at Driftwood Ranch. I'm the host of Literate Texan, which is a YouTube show that I created where we talk about literature, highbrow, lowbrow, and everything in between. It's been cooking in the back of my mind, this video I'm about to share with you. This 1980s local bookstore nostalgia. This actually happened while I was filming a video. I got a text from a friend of mine named Steve. We used to hang out at a bookstore. We grew up in Bonham, Texas, home of the world famous Fighting Purple Warriors. But we grew up during the 1980s there. I was born in 1970. Steve's born in 71 or 72, but we used to hang out at the same bookstore and stuff. We had a bunch of buddies played in fantasy role-playing games up there and stuff. You know, that was the golden era of that Dungeons & Dragons kind of thing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the video. Stay tuned for that if you're interested in fantasy role-playing games and stuff. Stay tuned for that even if you're not, because it's interesting and funny. But anyway, I was just thinking, he sent me a text and he said, several years ago, I lost my copies of the first 9 books in the Xanth series. And man, I hadn't thought about Piers Anthony's Xanth series in years. I did a little looking online and stuff, and they're still going on. He's up to like book number 50 in this series now. But I remember as a teenager really enjoying the Xanth series, and I was exposed to the Xanth series at the bookstore there in Bonham, Texas in the 1980s. The bookstore was called Cardwell's Books and Hobbies. It was owned by a man named Paul Cardwell. He's no longer with us, but he was something of a mentor to me as I was growing up. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to talk a little bit about what was on the shelves there then? Because what was on the shelves at this bookstore is what helped shape me as a reader. Now, this wasn't my only influence, don't get me wrong. I had multiple influences. I was also a rat down at the library too, you know. And, you know, keep in mind too that by the end of the 1980s, I was only 20 years old. I'm 55 now, so I've got 35 more years of books and reading that have shaped me. But this is some really early formative stuff for me. And I thought, you know what? Why shouldn't I make a video about what was on those shelves down there? And not everything on those shelves was stuff that I read, and not everything on those shelves was stuff that I liked. But so here's a little trip down memory lane. The first book series that I'm going to mention that I remember from there was the Fuzzy books by H. Beam Piper. And the first one was called Little Fuzzy, and the second one was called Fuzzy Sapiens. I think there's been a third book published since then, but it wouldn't have been on the bookshelves in those days. And this was not a 1980s book at all. This was actually published originally in the 1960s, mid to late 1960s. And the premise is there's a planet called Zarathustra, and on this planet, you know, there's a bunch of valuable minerals, and there's a prospector down on the planet. And, you know, he's doing his best to make his fortune, just like people do. And there's rare minerals and diamonds and jewels and stuff. And he discovers a race of aliens that he calls the Fuzzies, the little Fuzzies. And they're basically little short people with fur all over their bodies. They don't really talk. And they don't wear clothes, but they've got a little tool they use, a chopper. It's a little blade that they use. And they look kind of like cats in the face. They got the big cat-like eyes and stuff like that. In my imagination, they're kind of like kobolds, but instead of looking like kobolds, they look like cats. But the question arises, you know, are they sapient or not? Because if they're not sapient, you know, it's still fair game to be a prospector on the planet. But if the Fuzzies are sapient, you know, then they own the mineral rights to their planet. And so all the money to be made there is no longer there to be made for explorers and treasure hunters. It's there to be made on behalf of the Fuzzies. So what I remember most about it, from my perspective, and this is probably not the perspective that most people had, was that the owner of the bookstore, Paul, had taken the characters of the Fuzzies, the race of the Fuzzies, and made that a playable race in the fantasy game that we played down there. We played a fantasy role-playing game called Runequest down there every Saturday. And Runequest was, at one time, it's still available now. It's called Runequest Adventures in Chlorantha now, and it's I don't know if it's the 6th edition or the 7th edition or the 8th edition. I don't know. Back then, in the 80s when I was hanging out down there, it was probably the 2nd edition. But I remember they were a playable race. And not that I know why anyone would want to play them, because they were small and weak and didn't wear armor, and they weren't powerful at all. And, let's face it, most fantasy role-playing games were power fantasies. At any rate, that was the first thing I started thinking about. And then I thought, well, what else was on the bookshelves down there? Well, and I wrote some of this stuff down because I didn't want to forget it. So the second thing that I remember, and this is a big one, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series by Douglas Adams was really big down there. Paul had a great sense of humor, and he thought those books were really funny, and they were really funny. And there were multiple books in the series. It eventually became a trilogy in 5 parts, which was a joke of the authors. But the first one was called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And basically it's about a human being who finds out at the last minute that they're going to destroy the planet Earth to make room for some kind of interstellar bypass. But there's another guy on Earth who's been masquerading as a human for a while, and he's not human, he's an alien, and he's doing research for the latest edition of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is sort of a combination travel log and encyclopedia. And on the cover of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it says, "Don't panic." And it's full of wisdom about traveling around the galaxy, traveling around the Milky Way, and having more fun while you're doing it, being safer while you do it. So that was the first book in the series. Second book in the series was called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which I thought was a terrific title. And then there was Life, the Universe, and Everything. That was the third book. And then not the final book, but the fourth book was called So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, which was cool. That's the dolphins telling everybody goodbye because they left Earth before the bypass thing, and that's what they told everybody was so long and thanks for all the fish. But at any rate, I remember those, and I remember really liking those, and I have a feeling those would stand up really well today if I were to read them again. I never actually read the Fuzzy books. I just know what they were about. But yeah, I did read all the Hitchhiker's Guide books, but I only read them once or twice, and it was when I was much, much younger, so I don't really remember much about them, except they were legitimately smart and legitimately funny. They started in about 1979. So number 3 on my list here, what have we got? Okay, that's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's number 2. Number 3 is, what does that say there? Lord of the Rings. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, being a fantasy fan, Paul definitely kept the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit in stock, but he didn't keep the other books like the Silmarillion in stock there at the store. He could special order them for you and stuff. And, I don't have a whole lot to say about the Lord of the Rings. We're going to be reading the Lord of the Rings as part of the Lone Star Book Club starting in November. So we'll have plenty to say about the Lord of the Rings then. But I think most people are familiar with it now. It's even more popular now than it was back in the day because of the very successful and very good movie series that they made out of the Lord of the Rings. The Peter Jackson films were great. Now, his adaptation of The Hobbit was not great, but that's another story, and I don't want to get into that right now either because I'm in a good mood and I don't want to get in a bad mood. But yeah, Lord of the Rings, fantastic. I didn't discover the Lord of the Rings at the local bookstore, though. That's one of the books that I discovered at the library. I just remember it was always in stock at the bookstore, and it was always displayed prominently at the bookstore. And it was popular with everybody. High fantasy, the Lord of the Rings. Number 4 on my list is Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever series by Stephen R. Donaldson. Okay, so these are similar, or supposedly similar, to the Lord of the Rings. This is also high fantasy. But I think it's awful. I thought these books were just terrible. I hated them. They were in stock up there. I thought they were really hard to read. They didn't flow very well. And I also thought the main character, Thomas Covenant, was not sympathetic character at all. This is no Frodo Baggins here. It's really hard to like this guy. He kind of a sad sack, feeling sorry for himself all the time, doesn't treat others very well. There's a Dark Lord, and he's responsible for stopping him and stuff. But, I don't think it holds a candle to the Lord of the Rings. But it was there. Fantasy in the 80s was different than fantasy is now. There was less of it available, and what was available was a little more cookie cutter then. you know. And that was just kind of a knockoff of the Lord of the Rings. I don't know, you might disagree with that. You might say down in the comments, hey, Thomas Covenant was great. And if you do and you want to make the case for that, go ahead, man. I would love to read what you think of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. Number 5 on my list is Thieves World, which is a series that started in 1979. And I love talking about Thieves World. And I'm only going to talk about it briefly here, but eventually I'm going to make a whole series of videos about the Thieves World books, okay? Robert Ashburn was the creative force behind Thieves World. He was sitting around at a fantasy and science fiction convention one night with other fantasy and science fiction writers like Andrew J. Offutt and I don't know if she was his wife yet, but she eventually became his wife, Lynn Abbey, Janet Morris, and they're talking about how great it would be if they didn't have to reinvent the fantasy world every time they wrote a book. How cool would it be if you could have a fantasy novel where Conan the Barbarian and Gandalf the Grey go on an adventure together? And so they decide, well, there's no reason we can't do this. So they set up an anthology series set in a town called Sanctuary. Sanctuary is this gritty little seaport town. I don't remember the name of the world that it's set in, but it's an imperial backwater. And, you know, the people who hang out there, there's swords and sorcery, but these aren't Gandalf the Grey types. You're not going to run into Frodo Baggins at the local tavern. The local tavern, by the way, in the book is named the Vulgar Unicorn, which I think is terrific. And it's in a neighborhood called the Maze, which I also think is terrific. But yeah, you've got your wizards, you've got your warriors, you've got your thieves guild and your mercenaries. But these guys are more anti-heroes than heroes. And you came to the book with a short story. You came to each anthology with a short story, if you were a writer. And it was about a character that you created. And you could use any of the other characters that the other creators had created. You just couldn't kill them off. You know, you couldn't make major changes to them either. Okay, so if I'm writing a story and my main character is a thief called Shadowspawn, I can have him team up with a wizard, Enos Yorl, for example, and no harm, no foul, as long as I don't kill off Enos Yorl. Okay, so, and the guy in charge of keeping up with the shared continuity was Robert Ashburn. And the anthology series went on for 12 books. And were hugely influential. There were other shared universe anthologies after this. One of the most notable being Wildcards, which George R.R. Martin of Song of Ice and Fire fame edited, and it's a superhero anthology in the same vein. They didn't carry that at the bookstore, but they did have the Thieves World books, and they were just terrific. And over time, eventually some of the authors spun their characters off into novels. Over time, they came out with another series of anthologies. This series edited by Lynn Abbey, but the series I remember, okay, the one from the 80s that was at my local bookstore, started with the first one, Thieves World, and continued with Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn. And all of them had really great names, beautiful cover art. But yeah, these were a bunch of rogues and people you didn't necessarily want to hang around with in real life, but you loved reading their stories in these books. And you know, probably my favorite fantasy from the 1980s would be the Thieves World books, okay? So that was number 5 on my list. Number 6, Conan the Barbarian, another sword and sorcery character created in the 1930s by Robert E. Howard. But I learned, and there were 21 stories about Conan the Barbarian published in Weird Tales mostly, written by Robert E. Howard. But being a child of the 80s, I learned about Conan the Barbarian through a set of paperbacks, and there were 12 of them, called the Lancer Conan series, or the Ace Conan series. And these were a series of books that took Robert E. Howard's stories and put them in the internal chronological order of the stories. You know, as they were originally published, they were all over the place in the chronology of the stories. In fact, the first Conan the Barbarian story ever published, it's already towards the end of his career, and he's already the king of Aquilonia, which comes when he's about 60 years old. But they thought they could turn Conan the Barbarian's life story into an epic fantasy along the lines of Lord of the Rings and have one long story. And I don't think they succeeded in this. I don't think most people think they succeeded in it. But one of the things that they did was they would take partially finished stories that Robert E. Howard had started and they would finish them, or they occasionally wrote stories of their own, or they would occasionally take a story that Robert E. Howard had written about an entirely different character and reskin it as a Conan story. So that's how they wound up with 12 books. I don't know how many stories that amounted to total, but it was far more than the 21. And they were in a different order. Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp were the two editors who did this. And they also changed some of the writing and the words. And if you've read the original Robert E. Howard stories, you can see how much stronger he is as a writer and how poor a job they did of editing them. But, like I say, without those books, I wouldn't know who Conan the Barbarian was. And I feel like a lot of people who grew up during the 80s is the same way. They were introduced to Conan the Barbarian through that series of anthologies. Number 7. All right, let's talk about Piers Anthony and the Xanth books. That's how I opened this video, talking about it, okay? Xanth is a magical fantasy land. And these were really cool covers. They had these really brilliant, brightly colored covers. And they were a lot more lighthearted than any of your other fantasy series. Lord of the Rings wasn't really lighthearted. I mean, they were big, momentous events going down. And the characters were all big guys, you know. They were major earth-shaking characters. For the most part, they were either really, really good guys or really, really bad guys. And then in your sword and sorcery stuff, like in Conan and Thieves World, it's just the opposite. These are minor characters who, you know, are looking to solve minor quests, and Xanth is somewhere in between. But also, Xanth is a lot more lighthearted, and it's basically a peninsula. And there's a boundary, okay, between Xanth and a land called Mundania. Xanth is a magical land. Mundania is a land with no magic, okay? And there's a border. And you're not supposed to go into Mundania. But everybody in Xanth has got a distinct magical power. And most people in Xanth have a magical power that doesn't amount to much. Like, for example, I might have a magical power that I can make a blue polka dot appear on my right cheek, okay? It's a magical power, but it's not really very useful. The usefulness of your magic power determines a little bit of your social status, and if your magical power is powerful enough, then you're considered a wizard, and only wizards can be king. On the other hand, if you don't have a magical power at all, you can't stay in Xanth. You get exiled to Mundania. In the first book in the series, the Xanth series, the first book is called A Spell for Chameleon. And it's about a character named Bink who doesn't have any magical powers. And he goes to see the good magician Humphrey, whose magical power is knowledge, to see if he can help him figure out what his magical power is before he gets banished into Mundania. And if you look closely at the maps that come in the book, because like a lot of good fantasy books, Xanth books come with maps, but if you look closely, you'll see Xanth is a little peninsula. It's basically Florida. Okay, but it's a magical Florida. So anyway, there's a whole series of books, and Piers Anthony really likes puns, and so as the books go along, they get sillier and sillier and more filled with puns, to the point where they're not enjoyable to me anymore. Now, Paul Cardwell, who owned that bookstore, this guy loved his puns, and he never got tired of the Xanth series. But yeah, after the first 6 or so books in the Xanth series, I'd had enough. Also, you know, I grew attached to characters in the series, just like you do when you read a series about any characters. And those characters became less important as their stories were told, and then they became background characters as new characters stepped to the forefront. And I never found any of the new characters nearly as compelling as the old characters were. So I drifted away from Xanth fairly quickly. In fact, definitely before the 9th book. I probably stopped at about book 6, which was, I think, called Nightmare. The book before it was Ogre. But I think Nightmare was kind of a special event Xanth book in that it had all the major characters from all the previous books in it. So everybody was excited because it had the whole kind of reunion gimmick going on for him. But that's not the only Piers Anthony that I read or that he wrote. You know, the guy cranks out the books. He's a very prolific author. And one of the other series he wrote was called Incarnations of Immortality. And it was about the people who were certain concepts made into a being who made those concepts happen. They were incarnations. So, for example, Death, made to incarnate, was in a book called On a Pale Horse. And these books are all about the people who wind up taking over these guises. Eventually, you get to one, For the Love of Evil, I think was the name of it, where the incarnation is Satan himself. But I remember these being really entertaining and somewhat philosophical in a sophomoric kind of way set of reads. So yeah, those were fun. And the Incarnations of Immortality series, and those rolled right along during the late 70s, early 80s. Then in the mid to late 80s, there was a series of books called what were they called? The first book was called Split Infinity. The second book was Blue Adept, and the third book was called Juxtaposition. This was called the Phase Trilogy, or the Apprentice Adept series. And the main character is a character named Styles, and it features two planets, or two worlds. One of the worlds is called Proton, the other world is called Phase. Proton is a science fiction setting, okay? Phase is a magical setting. Styles exists in both settings and eventually realizes it, knows it. And in Proton, in the science fiction setting, he's kind of a nobody. But in Phase, he's a powerful magician. And eventually, the two worlds cross over, hence the book called Juxtaposition. But I remember enjoying those very much, even though I don't remember the details of the plots very much. But yeah, these are books I would go back and read again. Let's see, next on my list is the Gor series by John Norman. Anybody who knows me knows that I love Sword and Planet novels. These are novels that are like John Carter of Mars or A Princess of Mars, where you wind up on another planet, but it's really got medieval technology. There's not magic, but there's ancient technology. It might as well be magic because nobody understands it. There's a bunch of aliens. Everything's ancient. And they have adventures. And Gor is along those lines. And the first book is called Tarnsman of Gor. The main character is named Tarl Cabot. And Gor is also called the Counter Earth. And it's called the Counter Earth because it's just like Earth, the same size and everything. But it has the same orbit as the Earth, just opposite the sun. So we don't know about the existence of Gor because it's always directly opposite us on the other side of the sun. So Tarl Cabot winds up being transported to Gor, which is what happens in these Sword and Planet novels. And hijinks ensue. He gets involved in adventures there. Now, the thing about this Gor series is it's like Xanth. It goes on forever and ever. There's been at least 26 books in the series, maybe more. John Norman, the author of the Gor series, is a philosophy professor. But he has some strange philosophies when it comes to sex and men's relationships with women. And in the first 4 or 5 novels in the Gor series, you don't really hear much about that. Gor is spelled G-O-R, by the way. But you don't really hear much about that. But as the series goes along, John Norman takes more advantage of the opportunity to explain his theories about how women naturally want to be enslaved by men. And there's an active subculture of people who live their lives according to Gorian values. It's really, really weird stuff. But in terms of great adventure books, the first 4 or 5 books are great. After that, if you're a modern American male or female, the books get really weird, let's just say that. Sorry, John Norman, but they do get weird. And then next on my list, okay, now for something completely different, the Foxfire books were always on the shelves at the bookstore. Now, the Foxfire books were collections of articles from a magazine called Foxfire that was put together, I don't know if it was a local college or a local high school, but they went out and they were located near the Appalachians. And they would go out and they would find ancient Appalachian ways of doing things. The Appalachians are very self-sufficient. And they would write articles about it. Like I remember distinctly there was one article about how to make a rope bed. So you didn't need a box spring on the bed because you used rope and a bed frame for it. And there were 8 books in the series during the 80s. And it was the kind of thing that Paul was always interested in because he was interested in self-sufficiency and appropriate technology especially as it related to the fantasy role-playing games that we played up there. Because, you know, if you're going to play a fantasy role-playing game in a medieval setting, or even a pre-medieval setting, as we did, because Runequest was set during the Bronze Age, then, you know, it's helpful to know what kind of technology existed then and how it worked. And of course, the Appalachians, the technology's a little more modern, arguably, but it was also stuff that wouldn't be beyond somebody living in a Bronze Age society either. So they were just a cool bunch of books that were just like kind of a contrast from the science fiction and fantasy that the store seemed to specialize in. Now, the other books I have on my list here, okay, I got The Once and Future King by T.H. White on here. It's a retelling of King Arthur. Really fantastic stuff, and I'm glad he kept that in stock, and yeah, you should check that out. But then I've also got 3 fantasy role-playing games that stand out in my head as being available there all the time for purchase. One was called Runequest, the other was called Traveler, and the third one was called Call of Cthulhu, okay? So a fantasy role-playing game, if you've been living under a bridge and never seen the TV show Stranger Things, is a game where you sit around a table and you take on the roles of the characters. And one character is the game master, or the referee, or the dungeon master. And he sets up the situations. You, as your character, have a character sheet which outlines what your character can do and what his probabilities of success are. And then you try to do things to move the story forward. And they have their different settings. Like Runequest was a fantasy setting in a world called Xanth. It was created by Greg Stafford. And it was a world where magic is a part of everyday culture. Everybody has access to magic. You don't have to be a wizard. In that sense, it was a little bit like Xanth, but everybody had their little spells, their little charms. You know, if you were a cook, you had little charms that would make your food taste better that you would use, or that it would help you chop your onion faster without crying, for example. Weird setting, but really, really cool setting, and really different and well thought out compared to the pseudo-medieval setting of Dungeons & Dragons. Traveler, on the other hand, was a science fiction setting, and it was a science fiction game, and the fuzzy books are the kinds of books that would be set in a Traveler-type setting. And it was really great. We loved playing Traveler. We played it mostly at home. At the bookstore, we played on Saturdays, and we stuck with RuneQuest. But we played Traveler at home quite a bit because it was really fun generating planets and generating characters and generating their ships that they owned and sending them off on their little adventures. Usually they were, involved in some kind of free trading stuff. They were retired from the military and they were trying to make their fortune as space veterans. And then finally, and this is where I'm going to wrap the video up too, there was a game called Call of Cthulhu, which Sandy Peterson, a friend of mine, Sandy Peterson wrote a role-playing game that was set during the 1920s in the universe that H.P. Lovecraft set his stories in. And rather than being a game where you accumulate power and try to save the world, you're trying to save the world in Call of Cthulhu, but you're doomed to fail eventually. You might succeed temporarily, but you're going to try anyway. And that's what's brilliant about the game is your characters are really heroes because they know they can't save the day in the long run, not against the great old ones like Cthulhu. But they're going to try anyway. And anyway, really, really great game. It introduced the sanity metric to role-playing games, which is really cool because if your characters in Cthulhu became more powerful, they learned more spells, they automatically lost sanity. So to become a really powerful wizard, by definition, meant that your character went completely insane. That's how it worked. Really, really cool game. So I'm going to wrap up there, okay? That's just kind of a guided tour, not of my 1980s local bookstore, but of my memories of that 1980s local bookstore. And I have all kinds of other memories about the 1980s, but those are my memories of the bookstore, and those books and those experiences really had an effect on who I am and what I read today. And you can probably tell that if you watch some of my other videos and see what I'm talking about in those. So I've got more videos coming soon. Until then, please, folks, stay sexy and stay hydrated. I'll see you in the next video.